Hello and welcome to a special set of interviews for The Wire focused exclusively on mucormycosis. Until recently, it was believed that the people most likely to get mucormycosis were diabetics and those who had been overexposed to steroids. But a new hypothesis, which is widely believed by doctors, suggests that in fact the new strain of the virus B.1.617.2 is directly connected to mucormycosis. The explanation goes that this strain, known as the Delta variant, which was first found in Maharashtra and is now widespread in India, directly affects the beta cells in the pancreas, which in turn regulate insulin. That leads to transient diabetes, and in turn, that leads to mucormycosis. And if that hypothesis is true, and as I said, doctors increasingly believe it is, then it suggests that mucormycosis is a much more worrying problem than we initially thought, because it's not now any longer limited just to diabetics or to people who have been overdosed on steroids. Theoretically, anyone who gets COVID could also develop mucormycosis. And that means it's a particularly worrying problem. My first guest to talk about the subject is the head of the Bhumkar ENT Hospital and a member of the Maharashtra Mucormycosis Task Force, Ashish Bhumkar. Dr. Bhumkar, let me start with that central question. Previously, it was believed that the people most likely to get mucormycosis were diabetics or people overdosed with steroids. Now, the new hypothesis is that, in fact, the B.1.617.2 variant, which is widespread in our country, directly affects the beta cells in the pancreas, which in turn regulate insulin. That leads to transient diabetes and then can end up causing mucormycosis. And my question is simple. In your eyes, does this new hypothesis have credibility? Do you believe it?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, now we have enough data and experience to come down that there is no one single factor. So previously, pre-COVID, if people were diabetic, they were at high risk. But more and more, we realize that COVID induces, and I'm going to use two terms here, which probably a heightened hyperglycemia. And this could be transient. Fortunately, it is transient. Heightened hyperglycemia means the sugar levels skyrocket. Previously, you never had any history of diabetes or you did not know that you were even a pre-diabetic. And such a patient after COVID, the way I put it is his blood is actually turning into a sugar syrup. His sugar levels are going to 300, 400, we've seen 525. This is what is happening transiently. So this is a heightened state of hyperglycemia. And the other thing, I think at a more broader level, Karan, I would like to use the term immune dysregulation. You know, we keep talking about immunocompromised state, but there is something that we don't quite understand yet. But this COVID is definitely playing an havoc. You said perfectly, the beta cells of pancreas. One of the things where mucor is concerned, bigger villain than this sugar, which of course is the predisposing, is the free iron in your blood. The mucor does not get attracted only to sugar. Otherwise, most diabetics all over the world for all the time would have had it. There's something that goes wrong, that this rich blood rich in sugar allows something from the iron cells for free iron to start flowing. And it is these patients who catch the mucormycosis, as we currently understand.
That's very clear. Then let me ask you at this point two clarificatory questions. Is this why huge explosions of mucormycosis didn't happen during the first wave? Because the first wave was dominated by the original strain of the virus. The second wave is dominated by B.1.617.2, the Delta variant. So does this explain why the first wave did not see many cases of mucormycosis? The second wave is?
Most definitely. That's the only plausible explanation, because all other factors have actually remained more or less constant. All other factors all over the globe. I mean, the sugar has been going up, steroids have been used, but what has changed is the virus. I mean, that mutation and how it is affecting now the human metabolism, especially in Indians, and one could go down to the epigenetics and genetics of that. So it's a combination of both, but predominantly more and more we believe it is this mutant, the Delta mutant, which is doing some havoc biochemically in the body, which is making you prone to catching mucor.
Let me ask you a second clarificatory question. Is this also the reason why, despite the fact steroid overuse has been traditional in India for many, many years, but that overuse in the past hasn't led to mucormycosis? The difference this time is the overuse is happening at the same time as the virus B.1.617.2, the Delta variant, is specifically attacking the beta cells in the pancreas.
Correct, absolutely right. These two things have come together in sync, and take one away from the other, and perhaps mucor would not be there. But these two things coming together, sure, there is a role of the steroid, as because beyond just increasing your blood sugar levels, it also has a suppressing effect on your immune system. So the steroid also is not just only sugar. There's far more to it. But the combination of the delta and the steroid is probably a lethal combination for inviting a mucor in
So,
the human body.
using layman's language, would I be wrong or would I be correct if I say that the fire is lit by B.1.617.2, the Delta variant? Steroids add fuel to the fire, but they don't cause the fire.
Absolutely, absolutely right. Because there are many a patients, more than 20 or 25% of the patients from the database, they perhaps not taken the steroid at all. They were at home, they were not given steroid, or if at all given a very low dose, which is not known to cause at an appropriate time. The word going around is judicious use of steroid. Even those who have been given a judicious dose have landed up with mucor. So
And
you're right. The poor.
let me ask you this, Dr. Bhumkar. Could it be the case that mucormycosis is no longer limited to diabetics or people who have had excess steroid? Theoretically, anyone who gets COVID, and if their glucose levels are not properly monitored, could end up getting mucormycosis.
So that second part is more important. I think if their glucose levels are not. So the real hope and the medical treatment for this is in monitoring. So sure, purely COVID, the Delta variant causing you infection, and if your sugars remain uncontrolled, that combination can cause you mucor.
The problem is, if you are not a diabetic, you may not be aware that your sugar levels are not properly under control. And therefore, the ignorance of the fact could actually become a very big problem for you.
Sure, most definitely. Therefore, just like the pulse oximeters became a household gadget, I think now the glucometer is with Mucor giving us a signal, or the COVID Delta variant giving us a signal that expect the unexpected. I think it's time now to start monitoring the sugar levels of anybody who gets the COVID from day one onwards. We know currently the way Mucor is affecting, the highest risk is in the first 50 days. Day one being the first day of the symptom. Maximum cases are seen up to 50 days of COVID.
So,
So,
therefore, this also means, Dr. Bhumkar, that mucormycosis is a much more worrying phenomenon than we initially thought. It's a more dangerous problem.
so for everything in COVID, we have actually relied on our pre-COVID knowledge of medicine. And a lot is changing. So we have to rethink, we have to actually realign our knowledge and start looking at things. So earlier, Mucor used to be restricted to these sort of terminally ill, high sugar patients. And we carried forward that hypothesis. But then, as more and more data is coming in, 25-year-olds, 30-year-olds coming in with Mucor, not been to a hospital, not given any oxygen. And this is where our resetting of the knowledge is happening.
Let
That
me put
sure,
to you, let me put you two alternate hypotheses, even if you only want to reject them. Some people say that the real cause of mucormycosis is not what we are talking about, the fact that B.1.617.2, the Delta variant, attacks the beta cells of the pancreas. The real problem is that during the second wave, industrial oxygen increasingly replaced medical oxygen. We don't know what sort of pipes industrial oxygen has passed through that brought the fungus. Others say the problem is to do with injudicious use of zinc. Do you accept these two hypotheses, or do you say no, they're deflecting attention? The real problem is B.1.617.2.
yeah, I absolutely reject those. I call it there is a host factor, and these are the ghost factors. It's like the seed and the soil. No matter how many seeds you put on a stone, they are never going to get fertilized or never going to germinate. So unless there is a change that is happening in the host, these mucorspores are present from the day we are born till while we speak, we are inhaling the spores. But
Okay.
the soil is not ready. So no matter what the source is, and you could blame anything, but that really doesn't hold, because unless there's a host which is receptible or that it can germinate, you cannot get mucor.
In which case, if the critical causative factor is the Delta variant B.1.617.2, then let me ask you this. Another country where B.1.617.2 is spreading and spreading rapidly and the government is worried is the United Kingdom.
Good, yes.
Have they done studies in the United Kingdom to see whether mucormycosis is also growing in the UK?
So I'm not aware of it, but I'm sure they are alert about this because this variant is the main villain here. But just the variant is not responsible. Again, I think now they have enough knowledge to start controlling the sugar levels. So if we control the sugar levels, then the fear of, in spite of the variant, the fear of mucor is not there.
That's the critical thing. You must control the sugar or glucose levels. The problem is, if you're not a diabetic and you have no need or experience of having to control your sugar levels, you might not be aware that they are rising worryingly. And therefore, you could end up developing mucormycosis through a form of transient diabetes without realizing that is happening, which is why you say you need, in fact, what you call monitoring of sugar, just like you have monitoring of oxygen by every single COVID patient from day one. And that means that along with oximeters, we should also have what you call glucometers.
That's right.
Two quick questions because we're coming to the end of this interview. You said that the way the variant attacks the pancreas's beta cells can lead to transient diabetes. Is there a danger it could become long-lasting diabetes?
So fortunately, I think there are varying opinions about this, but the vast majority, over 3 to 6 months, come to their pre-COVID state of metabolism or the biochemistry. I mean, they have to be followed up, but it's like an accident. I consider this as a metabolic accident. The COVID infection is a temporary metabolic accident, and just like if you get a broken arm or a broken leg, in 3 to 6 months it repairs itself. I believe in a vast majority it repairs, especially in the young, and they don't become diabetics for life.
My last question, because this is a subject that's not going to worry people, particularly because we brought it to the attention, A, that mucormycosis is a more worrying problem than we initially thought, and B, because we've said it's not limited to diabetics, it's not limited to people who've had an overdose of steroids. Theoretically, anyone who gets COVID and whose glucose levels are not monitored, and the ignorant don't monitor levels, you could end up with mucormycosis. In that context, briefly tell me, what are the symptoms people should look out for so that they know they've got it or they can detect it when it's still at a very early stage?
In India, this term that sinus pain is a very common pain, a common symptom that they say. So if previously you never had actually a sinus problem, most people know what is a sinus. So they will take their hand to the face and say, I have a sinus pain. If previously you never had anything like a sinus pain or a sinus discomfort, and now from day one of COVID, typically day 8 and onwards, you start experiencing some uneasiness on the side of your face, that should be the first alarm sign. The more dangerous alarm sign is when you start getting a sense of numbness over the cheek. This is when you know that something is going wrong. The tooth can give you more and more. We are seeing patients presenting with tooth problem. They're not able to bite on an apple, or what they could earlier chew, they're not able to chew. The tooth suddenly starts to becoming loose. And of course, the dreaded complications are they're presenting with eye symptoms like a swelling of the eye or the ability of the eye to move itself. That starts to get diminished or it gets frozen. And in the worst case, the eye goes blind.
I,
But comfort in and around the nose, I think, is the first mildest sign of mucor.
I'm very grateful to you, Dr. Bhumkar. Thank you very much for making time, for explaining in such detail why this hypothesis is one that you believe in, why, as a result, mucormycosis has become more worrying. And what this means is that anyone who gets COVID must monitor their glucose levels, because you don't know whether you're getting and developing symptoms of this dreadful disease. Thank you very much indeed. I thank you for making time for us. But to the audience, I'll say, don't go away. We have one more guest yet to join us. That's Dr. Sailesh Kothalkar, consultant ENT surgeon at the 7-Star Hospital in Nagpur. See you in a moment's time. Welcome back to the second of our special interviews on mucormycosis. I'm now joined by Dr. Sailesh Kothalkar, consultant ENT surgeon at the 7-Star Hospital in Nagpur. Dr. Kothalkar, let me begin with the key question. Up till now, it was widely believed that the people most likely to get mucormycosis were either diabetics or people who had been overexposed to steroids. But now there is a growing hypothesis, which most doctors believe is correct, that the B.1.617.2 strain of the virus, known as the Delta variant, which is, of course, first found in Maharashtra and is now spread right across the country, it's now believed that this strain affects the beta cells in the pancreas and can create transient diabetes, which in turn leads to mucormycosis. Do you, as a leading surgeon, believe this hypothesis is correct?
Yeah, this is very true, Mr. Karan. We are running a COVID hospital here, and last year also we have treated more than 7,000 patients. And this year, almost same numbers have been discharged from our hospital. But during last COVID-19 wave, we did not see a single patient of mucormycosis. And this time, we started getting this mucormycosis from the distant places like Amravati and Akola, because they had this second wave earlier than the Nagpur. And it's rightly said that this new COVID variant is affecting the beta cells of the pancreas, and it is making persons who were non-diabetics, they are, because of the affecting the beta cells of the pancreas, there is an increased number of population who has become a diabetogenic. So initially they were not diabetics, but now after the COVID, they have become the diabetics. And in our series of patients, it's almost 40% of people who have been found newly diabetic.
That's a very large number. Can I ask you about that?
Yes, true.
You said that last year and this year, both years you had roughly 7,000 COVID patients, but last year, not one of them had mucormycosis. How many of the 7,000 this year have ended up with mucormycosis?
Current, these are the statistics from my hospital, because we run a COVID hospital. And this year also, we did not get a single patient from our hospital. So basically what has happened is, when it was a pandemic and the hospital strength was not sufficient to cater to all the patients, many of the different physicians, general practitioners, they started treating COVID. And there the use of steroid was found rampant. Means whichever patients which we got in our hospital, they were given a solomedrol injection, and it was given up to 1 milligram. Ideally, we don't give it that much. So we give it only 40 milligrams, 60 milligrams. But we saw the patients who have received 1 gram of solomedrol, and that is huge a dose to cater to the cytokine storm, which patient lands up in the second week of the COVID. So rampant use of steroid, that is one cause. Plus the COVID, this variant is found to be the immunosuppressive, and plus the steroid itself causes severe immunosuppression. So these two conditions, they cause the immunosuppression, and that led to the mucormycosis.
Now, on a famous WhatsApp timeline Twitter put out by Joe Wallen, he says that you have treated 280 patients with mucormycosis this year alone, and of them, 151 required surgeries. Are those figures put out by Joe Wallen correct?
Yeah, when Joe visited us, it was 151, but now the figure which we have operated is 174. Joe visited us 15 days back.
So in fact, whereas last year, when the first wave happened, you had no cases of mucormycosis, this year, you've had a very, very substantial increase, 174 surgeries, over 280 patients altogether. That's a huge jump compared to last year.
Exactly. Last year, there were not a single patient operated in my setup. A couple of centers have reported that they have operated some 10, 12 patients, but that was a very insufficient, and 10, 12 patients in a year we get in immunosuppressed patients. Maybe those patients on the organ transplantees receiving steroids for lifelong. Those patients, they are bound to have this, but the numbers were very less as compared to this time.
I want to pick up on something else you said in an early answer. You said 40% of the patients coming to you this year have ended up with diabetes. They didn't have it earlier. This is because of the way,
Exactly.
this is because of the way the Delta variant attacks the beta cells in the pancreas, creating transient diabetes. Will these 40% only suffer transiently from diabetes, or could it become long-lasting diabetes?
It's going to be a long-lasting diabetes. It's going to be the disease for them for the rest of their life. Because once the beta cells are damaged, they are not known to recover. So all those patients which we have, this 40% populations, we have to monitor their sugars very regularly. We have to keep them their sugars in the normal limits so that the disease doesn't worsen. Because in spite of doing a good surgery and in spite of giving them the antifungals, the diabetes is the one, that is the acidotic stage of the diabetes, is known to cause this fulminant infection more.
So, in layman's language, we have a rather worrying situation. First of all, we have established the hypothesis that B.1.617.2, the Delta variant, affects the pancreas and leads to mucormycosis. You believe that is very true. Secondly, your own experience at the 7-star hospital has shown this time around that 40% of patients have developed diabetes as a result of COVID, and you believe this will be long lasting and they will have to live with it hereafter.
Yes, because we are following such patients for almost 3 months now, and their sugar levels are still high. So our advice to them that wherever they are coming from, they have to monitor their sugar. So this 3 months follow-up with them suggests us that it's not going to go down and they have to remain diabetic for rest of their life. That's what we can conclude.
Two things then follow, Dr. Kothalkar. The B.1.617.2 variant, the Delta variant, first found in Maharashtra and now widespread in India. I'm deliberately saying it is widespread in India, has two very worrying outcomes. One, it can give you mucormycosis if your glucose levels are not monitored because it affects the pancreas. And secondly, it can also leave you with diabetes. Therefore, this Delta variant is particularly problematic, particularly worrying, much worse than the first one of the original type.
Exactly, you rightly said, because this variant is causing more devastating complications. Likewise, we know that the patients are getting mucormycosis. But another study, all these patients we have, we found that these patients, they get suddenly get the heart attacks because this fungus is a angio-invasive fungus. It invades the blood vessels. So the commonest findings in our setup in our series is many of the young people, they are getting the cerebral infarcts because of the less of the blood supply or occlusion of the blood vessels supplying to the brain. That is one finding. And second finding is the common incidences of the heart attacks. These two things which we are observing along with the mucor patients, and those affected recently and not the last time.
Let's then for a moment focus on mucormycosis, popularly known as the black fungus. Are we now not more or less establishing that mucormycosis is not limited to people who have diabetes and get COVID? It's not limited to people who get COVID and are given an overdose of steroids. Other people too, who just get COVID, but if they don't monitor their glucose levels, could still end up theoretically with mucormycosis. Isn't that right?
Yeah, exactly. These things are happening. Because see, when the patients are in the hospital and during the beginning of the second week, when patient lands up in the cytokine storm, that is the time when steroids are administered. But we have found out, along with this diabetes, like sugar levels, we have found out that IL-6, that is the inflammatory marker which is released during the cytokine storm, and the serum ferritins level of the patients, those two factors also were very high in those patients who are suffering from mucor. So not only the sugar levels, but their IL-6 levels and their serum ferritin levels are also equally raised. And that is what these three parameters we find higher in all the patients who are suffering from mucor.
Dr. Kothalkar, if it is the case that any patient of COVID can theoretically end up with mucormycosis, then do we need from the start of getting COVID to monitor glucose levels just as we monitor oxygen levels? And does that mean that just as patients need oximeters, they will also need what is called glucometers?
Exactly right. Like we have been advocating this type of prescribing a glucometer to every patient who's getting discharged from our hospital. So that trend we have been following, and this particular advice has been given to the Maharashtra Task Force that these patients should be given glucometers, because after discharge, when they go home, we cannot monitor their glucose. And many of the patients are from urban and as well as from the rural areas. So glucometer is the one which will help them to monitor their glucose level. If they find it abnormal, then they have to consult their physicians immediately. So this is a need of a time that every discharge post-COVID patients need to monitor their sugar levels with the glucometers at home.
Then let me put this to you, because we're coming to the end of the interview. Doesn't this mean that mucormycosis is a much more worrying phenomenon than we initially thought it to be? Previously, we thought it was limited to diabetics or people who had an excess of steroids. Now we know that theoretically, anyone who gets COVID can get mucormycosis. Secondly, it also means that this variant B.1.617.2 that gives you mucormycosis also ends up in 40% cases giving you diabetes, which is long lasting. So both mucormycosis and B.1.617.2 both are very worrying.
Yes, exactly. This particular strain this time is a worrying because it's causing a lot many problems, and mucormycosis is also taking patient's life. So we have patient has to suffer on three stages. First, he has to undergo through COVID. So it's a financial loss, it's personal loss. Secondly, if he is detected to be a diabetic, then he has to take medication for rest of his life. Third, if he gets a mucor, then mucor is a very draining because the medicines are very costly. Treatment cost also involves a lot of instrumentation, almost 1 week to 2 hours in some patients, 3 to 4 hours of weeks of the hospital stay, and it drains them financially, physically, emotionally. So
Oh
many
dear, we
patients
seem to have lost.
now they have to suffer because of mucor. Oh, hello.
Carry on, please carry on.
So mucor is the one complication which these people they are suffering from. But we have to always remember that all these patients they get COVID first. Secondly, they become diabetic, and third, if they get a mucor, then mucor is a very exhaustive treatment. Surgical time involved, so surgery is also involved. They also involved in the number of surgeries. Thirdly, the cost of medication is too high. Any middle class family, they have to spend around 70 to 80,000 rupees for one single dose of amphotericin every day. So you can count it down. If 7 days of a treatment cost is around 7 to 8 lakhs of rupees, and out of that, maximum almost 80% of this cost is utilized for the taking medications. And surgery in hospital stay, it involves only 20% of the cost which patient has to incur. So mucormycosis is not only devastating, it also takes a lot of financial burden on the patient and their family part if they are not covered by the insurance.
Absolutely. I'm coming to my last question. Mucormycosis is clearly a triple whammy, as you've explained. But let me ask you this.
Yes.
There is one other country where B.1.617.2, the Delta variant, is spreading, and that is Britain. The British government itself is very worried about the spread of B.1.617 in Britain. Are we in Britain witnessing a similar increase in mucormycosis?
Yes, if this particular viral strain is affecting the population in Britain, they can expect the outburst of the mucor after 2 to 3 weeks of the patients who have gone positive. That's for sure.
So you're saying 2 to 3 weeks later, after patients in Britain have developed B.1.617.2, and if their glucose levels are not monitored, they too could get mucormycosis. In other words, what is happening in India, the relationship between the variant and mucormycosis will also happen in Britain.
Exactly. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Dr. Kothalkar. We are having trouble with this second connection. The line and the Wi-Fi are poor, but what you said is crystal clear. I'm grateful to you for explaining the relationship between the new mutant B.1.617.2, the Delta mutant, and mucormycosis, and the fact that this means it's not limited to diabetics or to people overdosed with steroids. Theoretically, anyone who gets COVID can get mucormycosis, and that's why it's very worrying. Thank you very much indeed, sir. Take care.
Thank you, sir.
Stay safe. And now we have
Thank you, sir.
And now we have one last guest, Dr. Deepak Haldipur, Director ENT and Surgeon of the Trustwell Hospital in Bangalore, joining us to discuss the same subject. See you in a minute. Welcome back to the third of our special interviews on mucormycosis. We focus on that subject extensively today because today it is a question of great concern to the Indian people. Joining me now is Dr. Deepak Haldipur, Director ENT and Surgeon at the Trustwell Hospital in Bangalore. Dr. Haldipur, let me start with what for the audience is a key question. Up till now, it was widely believed that the people most likely to get mucormycosis were either diabetics or those who had been overexposed to steroids. But now the hypothesis that most doctors believe is correct is that there is a direct link between mucormycosis and the B.1.617.2 strain, what is called the Delta variant, first found in Maharashtra and now spread widely through our country. And this strain affects the beta cells of the pancreas, which gives or creates transient diabetes and leads to mucormycosis. Do you accept this hypothesis? Do you think this is a good explanation?
Karan, actually, first clarification, I'm not an intellectual, and number two, I'm not an academician in the strict sense of the term. I'm a foot soldier, I'm a surgeon, and I'm a doctor primarily. What I can tell you is to put the blame entirely on the new strain also is not fair, because a lot of these people, in fact, almost 85 to 90% of these people were diabetics. And number two, most of these people, about 75 to 85 people had not completed their vaccination schedule. And number three, as you correctly pointed out, this factor of the mutant COVID virus. And number four, the usage of steroids. Now, I must confess here that after the first wave, we were all focused on avoiding a cytokine storm, where these COVID patients, when their lungs get affected, these were the patients in whom we saw all the mortalities or the deaths. So probably we were all very aggressive in managing the cytokine storm. So the sheer numbers, we had to use steroids a little more. So to put the entire blame on the new virus may not be the correct thing. It has to be an equal share because see, India is a diabetes capital now. And last decade or so, we have not been really concentrating on handling our diabetes properly. So my viewpoint, if you would ask me, I would put 1/3 the blame on the diabetes, 1/3 on our focus on treating the COVID so that the people survive from the cytokine storm or the dangerous variety, and 1/3 probably to the mutant COVID virus. I would like to remind you here that the study is still ongoing. Though I have large numbers, the study is still not complete. It is on its way.
Let me put it like this, Dr. Haldipur. Is it the case that an ordinary COVID patient who is not a diabetic and who has not been overexposed to steroids can still get mucormycosis?
But the percentage is very, very low. The percentage of non-diabetic people who did not take steroids, some of them did show mucor, but the percentage was very, very low.
How low?
The
Can you give me a
percentage was
sense?
very
How low?
Maybe, see, out of my cases, if I would say early days, about 7 to 8% of the whole lot.
Some would say that's still quite high. 7 to 10% of your patients who got COVID were not diabetics, they had not had steroids, but they still ended up with mucormycosis.
Karan, you are a master of numbers. Now you tell me what's the difference between 7 to 8% and 7 to 10%? Not much. I said 7 to 8% and you are saying 7 to 10%.
Forgive
It
me.
all boils down to only 10%, no?
I thought
What
I
about the
heard
remaining
7 to 10%. I wasn't sure you said 7 to 8. But tell me, even 7 to 8% is a worrying number, isn't it?
I would still worry about the 92 because I am a practical doctor. What about diabetes? What have we been doing about diabetes, Karan?
Tell me something
We have
else.
been,
We'll come to diabetes in a moment's time. How is it that the virus leads to mucormycosis? Is it because this new virus B.1.617.2 affects the beta cells of the pancreas and that in turn controls insulin and therefore gives you transient diabetes, which sometimes leads to mucormycosis? Is that the chain?
See, Karan, mucormycosis was first reported in human history in 1857. It is not that before this second pandemic, I didn't see mucormycosis. We did. You see mucormycosis in all those patients in whom the nasal immunity comes down. So the nasal immunity can come down in two ways. One is as a part of the general immunity coming down. For example, if you are a patient of renal dialysis, a renal transplant, very low hemoglobin percentages, very badly controlled diabetes, if you are a person who is receiving chemotherapy or radiotherapy for cancer, and you are totally malnourished. These 7 categories of people were always getting mucormycosis even before. In this pandemic, because the sheer number of people who are diabetic, who are also receiving steroids for their COVID, were more, obviously probably the cases were more also. So put the blame entirely on the mutant COVID virus would be very, very early days. Very early days. I don't think there is,
I take your point. You would put the blame 1/3 on diabetes, 1/3 on treatment for COVID, which I assume includes steroid treatment, and 1/3 on the mutant virus.
No, even in that 1/3, I've got this theory of steaming. I told you, this excessive steaming, it is bringing down the nasal immunity, Karan. See, the nose has cilia. See, the steaming was a very good home remedy in the past when people had a common cold due to a common rhinovirus. 3 times in a year, if you steamed your nose twice a day for 2 days to reduce the decongestant, mixed with a little bit of eucalyptus oil, it worked wonders. But this WhatsApp Medical University in last year, March, and you told me you also did the steaming. So this WhatsApp University from March last year, people have been steaming to 8 to 10, 12 times, hoping that they won't catch the corona. Can you imagine a hot steam in the nose? The nasal immunity is controlled by the cilia and the mucus coat. So I would again divide that 30 into 15 and 15, Karan, because I'm running a crusade against steaming now. So just the way you run a crusade on what you believe. Yes.
Can I just clarify? You're referring to a conversation we had on the phone yesterday when I rang to ask if you would give me an interview. And what you're saying is that what you're saying is that the Indian habit of steaming is a particularly bad one at the moment, because what it does, it kills the nasal immunity in the nasal passage and perhaps makes you more liable to get mucormycosis.
Absolutely. In fact, the funniest and the most exasperating thing is, in ENT especially, people before they use Johnson buds or before they do steaming, they never ask any ENT doctor. They do it for a while and then they ask us. I still don't know why.
Okay, I take your point. So your advice, sir, your advice to the audience is please do not start steaming as if it is the
Absolutely.
best remedy when you get
Absolutely.
COVID.
Steaming is bad for the nose, other than as a home remedy used in a common cold when you actually get a cold and have congestion.
Let's
It is
come
useless
back.
in preventing cold.
Let's
Yes.
come back to mucormycosis. I take on board your advice about steaming. I think it's been heard. You've said to people, if you do get COVID, do not steam. It will enhance the chances of getting mucormycosis because it will affect the nasal bacteria in your nose.
Yes. Yeah.
Let's come back.
Yes.
Let's come back to mucormycosis. There's a lot of concern about it. You're saying that it's not as worrying, it's not directly linked to the virus. There are other factors that are responsible, A, being diabetic, B, overuse of steroids, and C, as you've now pointed out, silly use of steaming. So you're not worried about mucormycosis.
And sorry to disturb you, but what is disturbing is, in a house, if one person becomes positive for COVID and he's given some treatment, within 2-3 days, the likelihood of another 2-3 members in the house getting the same problem. The problem with our patients is they self-medicate with the same prescription given to patient A, which is taken by patients B, C, and D in that house. And that is where the steroid abuse comes in. If you take the steroid under good medical supervision, even now it works wonders, as long as it is used in moderation. It's a life-saving drug.
In other words, do not do imitative self-medication just because
Absolutely.
the mother are being required to have certain medicines. Doesn't mean if you get COVID, you need the same. Consult a doctor, get your own prescription, get his personal advice. But let's come back, because we're coming to the end of this interview. How serious, how worrying is mucormycosis? I get the feeling that you don't think the direct connection to the virus is a major factor at all. You first said 30%, you've now reduced it to 15%.
And see, now that the whole, thanks to the media, people, responsible people like you, patients across the country are aware of this problem. They are reaching us early in stage 1, very early stage. The cure rates are getting better. And number 2, I'm sure we'll have more and more amphotericin B in future.
Okay.
And with that, we should be able to handle it much better, Karan. Okay. And the numbers, yes.
One last question. Britain is another country, like India, where B.1.617.2 is spreading fairly rapidly. The government itself in Britain has expressed concern. Are we seeing cases of mucormycosis growing in Britain, or is that not the case?
They're not steaming. They're not steaming, Karan. It's as simple as that, which is why I'm running a crusade. The same virus there, same amount of obesity or more diabetics, but their diabetes is better controlled because they all attend their NHS clinics.
Okay.
It's so, as simple as that.
You're coming around to saying that the biggest cause of mucormycosis is unreasonable, stupid steaming.
One, and more important than that, lackadaisical attitude towards diabetes for the last 10 years by the whole nation. Whole nation.
Okay, that's very clear. In your eyes, the real causes of mucormycosis are not the variant. You reduced the mutant variant to just 15%. Initially, you said 30. You brought it down to 15. Bigger causes of mucormycosis are lackadaisical attitude towards.
Fantastic. Yeah, spot on.
Use of steroids, perhaps inadvisedly, and the reliance on silly steaming.
And an extremely poor attitude towards health and healthcare and towards diabetes, because India is the diabetes capital of the world now. Absolutely. That is the main pandemic.
Dr. Haldipur, that has been heard loud and clear by the audience, and I'll repeat what you say is your own crusade. Do not start steaming if you get COVID. Do not do it 3 or 4 times a day. It is a mistake. It kills the good bacteria in your nasal passage and makes you more liable to get mucormycosis. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Haldipur. I'm very grateful to you for making time. Take care. Stay safe.
Thanks, Karan.